Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of Keeping Up with MDN. Today we are joined with a incredible special guest all the way from Switzerland. He is an MDI alumni, previous deep learning lead, now called the Artificial Intelligence branch, and he's now working as a researcher at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, all the way from Switzerland. Give it up for Jason! Thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview. We just would like to take you back, first of all the way to the start of your journey. So, what initially sparked your interest in deep learning, machine learning, and how did you develop your passion for this journey to where you are now currently in Switzerland?
Yeah. So I think maybe almost, at this point, it's probably almost a decade ago or so. Like back when I was in high school, I remember when I guess like machine learning and deep learning were all like still very vague at that point. There were some like YouTube videos that some, random people had done using like machine learning and I think back then it was like more evolutionary like neural networks and stuff like that. So very long ago,
Yeah,
much before
love
a
that.
lot of the more recent stuff. But they were using them to play like just really like basic games. So we're talking like evolutionary algorithms to play like Mario, do really basic tasks like that. The stuff that's like fairly trivial right now using techniques you don't really see anymore. But like I don't know through middle of high school, it was super interesting. I didn't really know much about it at all, and so I saw it back then. I was like, oh, that's cool, and I put it out of my mind for the next 5 years or so, basically. And so then come to uni, and I was studying electrical engineering,
Yeah.
and
Sorry to
I think it
interrupt you.
was
Sorry to
yeah.
interrupt you. I just like to ask, and did through watching those YouTube videos, did that sort of help you decide your career path with uni and what degree you wanted to do? Did that sort of lead you to want to study electrical engineering, or rather?
So not at the time because it was like one of those things where like it was like super interesting, but like I
Yeah,
actually had like I didn't understand it at all. It was just
yeah,
kind of like this thing where like it more planted this idea in my mind that like, oh, there's this cool thing out there you can do with algorithms. This is well beyond me. I didn't know like anything about programming or coding or anything like until getting to uni. I was much more on the like engineering side of things back then. I thought, oh, this must be like well beyond me. Because I do remember there was a friend I had in like year 11, year 12 of high school who did a little bit of like stuff with deep learning themselves. And I was like, wow, this is like well beyond me. I had no idea what he was doing. I thought it was really cool, but I had no clue. So yeah, it wasn't necessarily like the jumping off point, but it was kind of like my initial introduction
yeah,
to finding out what it even was in the first place.
yeah. And then you went on to electrical engineering.
Yes. Yeah. So I went in. I did engineering because I thought it'd be interesting. Electrical engineering was the most interesting of those. But luckily for me, a part of electrical engineering did have some more, I guess, like programming courses and stuff. So I got to learn a little bit about that. And then it was actually it would have been the end of my second year, I think. Um, Probably around then, where I actually found like DeepNeuron in the first place because like back then I was like looking for something interesting to do. I was this was the middle of COVID at that point. I was bored at home looking for something to actually do, something that was interesting, and so I was like looking around for some either internships or student teams or clubs or something to join. When I was going through them all, Deep Neuron kind of jumped out to me as something, there was, oh, wow, this deep learning thing again. I know a lot more about programming now. I could probably actually do something with regards to it. And I was still interested in it. It was still like in the back of my mind. So I thought, yeah, sure, I'll go for that.
And
Um,
yeah, that's incredible. Um, along the lines of that as well. How has your experience at Deep Neuron and having led the deep learning branch contributed to your current role now as a researcher? Are there any specific skills or knowledge that you, I guess, gained from your involvement in the student team and that you find particularly valuable now?
yeah. So I'd say coming in at the end of like the second year of my degree or whatever I started, This was really my first, and DeepNeuron was my first introduction to, I guess, like doing research as a whole,
Yeah.
in the first place. And then also, I guess, more advanced like programming stuff like that. So the first project I did was the microscopian deep. It was like using um, some networks to compress like cell images basically, to learn some representation. I had never touched before this. I'd gone through the training for DeepNeuron, but I never touched any kind of like more advanced, I guess, like Python code like that. I hadn't done
Mm.
any research at all. I hadn't really had to work with researchers to think through a more advanced problem, like all this kind of stuff. I hadn't done any of it before. And so deep neuron for me was really like my introduction to a lot of this. And so it basically helped me develop those skills. From there, that was like basically a jump off point into like a summer research project I did in a like robotics field, which had some, again, like prediction of like slip using deep learning, or like basically I got into that program though because I had the experience with DeepNeuron that I could like transfer over and say, hey, I like know what I'm actually doing. I've actually done this before,
Mm.
and of course that from there really led to me getting into like deeper into research as a whole, and like led to me getting here
Yeah.
to
That was also
Switzerland.
one of
So
the
yeah.
questions I was gonna ask you was um after Deep Neuron and like is that sort of like what encouraged you to go pursue like the field of research more so than industry?
Yeah, pretty much. So yeah, during my degree, I didn't really know what I was planning to do when I finished. I thought I'd probably just go into industry or whatever because I didn't really think of research too much. But yeah, getting into deep neuron, trying research, I thought it was interesting. So I tried the summer internship. It was still interesting, and so I thought, cool, I might be interested in doing research. It was a long decision because it's like a big move to make, and so it really was more at the end of like my final year that I like actually decided, cool, I'll do research because that's the more interesting thing. Um, I also did get a chance to kind of try, I guess, more like industry like work. So I worked in a startup for like half a year or so, which is a lot more, I guess, yeah, structured in a much more like industry focused way. And that for me was kind of like the final like thing where it's like, hey, cool. I do think research is more interesting than like what I
And
was
that's
doing.
obviously led you all the way to Switzerland, which is absolutely incredible. You're there, it's a whole new experience, I'd imagine, different to Australia. Um,
Yes.
that's absolutely incredible. You're currently working as a researcher. Could you give us sort of maybe a day in a life? Could you possibly explain what are some what does like a typical work day look like for you as a researcher?
Yeah. It's super varied in some ways, I'll say. So I guess, um, you know, the thing with research is, and this is one of the benefits, but it also can be one of the downsides depending on, I guess, the kind of person you are, is that you've got like a lot of freedom as to what you can do. So for me, right now, my supervisors really kind of like, if you get the work done, it doesn't matter how you've got there, the work is done, and then it's fine. So for me, I would maybe like, I don't know, wake up at like 8 or 9 or so, get ready, go into the lab for, I don't know, a portion of the day, like around 8 hours or so. But the thing is, it's not really set. It kind of like fluctuates depending on other stuff I
Yeah,
need to do.
flexible.
And so, and
Yeah.
then, after that, I might like come back from work, cook dinner. Depending on how I'm feeling, I might relax in the evening, or I might like do some more work depending on like if there's deadlines, if I'm, really feeling like doing more work or whatever.
Mm.
And yeah, and when it comes to like the more like specifics, starting out for me, it's really been about the first thing was like really learning the field. So there's a lot of like reading through papers, trying to think through what are, I guess, like what are issues that you're interested in solving? What are the problems in the, like, I guess, interesting fields that should be addressed, like the really meaningful problems? And I guess then thinking through, yeah, what are the actual solutions to these problems that you've identified?
And
So like that
so to
involves, yeah,
um, what are you currently researching at the moment? If you're allowed to tell us, or
yeah,
if classified it for
Yeah,
vision?
I can say kind of generally. So when I came in, what I was like more interested in is like in general, it's kind of like vision and robotics. So those are the kind of like two main things that I was the most interested in. And so the lab I'm working in is like primarily a vision lab with the idea of like transferring the work to a more like robotics focus. And so for me in particular, the more interesting problem there was like longer term learning. So we've got lots of strong like vision models and stuff like that. But you know, our world is 3D. I feel like there's much more that we can get out of like having a 3D thing, like some kind of 3D learning. You see it a little bit in robotics because you're kind of forced to deal with the 3D world in that. But it's not really something that's like as explicitly dealt with in vision like too much. And even the way they do it in robotics is sometimes like quite limited. So that was kind of the more like subfield that I was interested in. And then from there, it really got down to what problems are there in the first place. And so for me right now, that's thinking of like learning some like useful representations in 3D. Um, there's been some recent work, for example, in like neural radiance fields. What they might do is instead of just having a normal kind of like model, like how the world would look, is kind of how this model what it normally outputs. You kind of augment that with what would, as for example, like a 2D vision model expect to see. So, as an example, if you have some model like Clip, which basically learns this representation that's like meant to be aligned with text. So, for example, if you give it a picture, it will output some representation that you can kind of match text against to see like how similar is this picture to some certain like textual description. What you can do is you can kind of distill all of that model into this like 3D model of the world. So now you've got a 3D model that's like a bit more like semantically meaningful. And so that's like a recent example, but then there's like, of course, there's like issues with that and improvements that should be done. And so, yeah, I'm looking into some of that basically.
So like sort of on like the law and ethics side as well, in terms of seeing like those rules and how that how it's used to implement and help the world on a good scale as well. That's incredible. Your current project sounds really fascinating. We'll sort of reflect on your journey as well now. What advice for those considering sort of your sort of career path, the postgraduate side of research, was there sort of like an application process for that? And how did the experience at DeepNeuron? I guess you've touched on it already. Sort of. You've written some research
Yeah.
papers as well. I am aware. Was that also to do with DeepNeuron as well?
So there's a few things to go into here. So the first thing I'll say is that I can speak from experience that the way I actually went through the application process myself has taught me a lot of like what not to do. And so that's what I can give you because I did my application process in not the best way that you could because I was kind of rushing last minute because I really made my decision quite last minute. And so, yeah, what I'll say is that the first thing is to, if you are interested at all, the first thing is to think about it earlier, if possible, because like if you really want to do the application process properly, you should really start like at least looking into things or applying more at like the start of the year, like the start of your final year, for example, because
And are there any sources that you would recommend to look into when applying? For example, any websites in particular?
ooh, so really when it comes
Put you
to
on the spot there, by the
doing,
way.
huh?
I put you on the spot there, by the way, with that.
Yeah, no,
Um,
it's fine. Because I do have some idea. So
way back.
when it comes to thinking about applications like this, the first thing you need to think about is like kind of like what I said before. What are you interested
Mm.
in? You can't just apply it to any random place or whatever and expect it to work. Unlike I guess like undergrad or maybe even masters, when you're applying for a PhD, it's going to be very like focused, right? Because you're more applying for a lab than like a university. So what you should do is first find out what you're interested in, then try and like look up maybe researchers or professors or people that could take you on who've done similar work or labs that are doing similar and related work. And so that can just be going through like Google Scholar papers, that can be going through university like websites and stuff like that. From there, once you've got like a list of people you might be interested in, then you can like look through the applications process for each of the individual like labs or universities, maybe message the professors. I mean, it can't hurt. A lot of the time they're not going to respond to you, but sometimes they will, and it will be really helpful.
There's a chance there.
Yeah, because sometimes, and so yeah, the reason you should do that early as well is because sometimes for the specific universities, they'll each have their own different kind of like process or like what they want. For example, some of the universities, if you're like looking to go to Australia, they have a very different process than going overseas. Some of the overseas universities want like standardized tests that you need to like prepare like a couple months in advance for, so you can actually do well in them. Yeah, there's this whole thing. So that's the actual application process. Now, when it comes to getting in to these kind of like postgrad roles, that's a whole separate thing. So what they really want nowadays, and it's a very, very, I guess, a competitive market almost is the way you can like put it. And nowadays, when it comes to postgrad research, because plenty of people want to do research in like machine learning or deep learning right now. It's a big thing right now, and so you get a lot of people coming into it. And so what that means is that it's kind of harder than ever, really, to apply to it. Doesn't mean you can't do it. There's plenty of options, but you really need to like think in advance. So a few things. The one thing to consider early on is: are you interested in going someplace overseas, or are you interested in staying like maybe more local? Like, are you happy maybe doing a PhD at like Monash or a Melbourne University or an Australian university, or do you want to go overseas somewhere? That's also going to change the amount of work you need to do. If you want to go overseas, what do they want from you? So, for example, I published, I think by the time I applied, it was like one or two papers at that point. And for me, that was not enough for some universities. Some universities have ridiculous expectations where they expect you to come out of undergrad with like 4 or 5 papers or whatever. And I mean, you can do that if you like really plan your degree around it in advance. Maybe take some time off, do some like student research or whatever. But yeah, it's something that you need to consider the expectation for. So yeah, really getting that research experience. I mean, it's always going to be generally helpful, but for some universities, it's like really critical. And you can do that. You can get that research experience by, DeepNeuron was the first one for me.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, how did you think you I got the opportunity to go to Switzerland? Was it the research papers? Was it DeepNeuron? It was like I guess a whole bunch of that mixed in together.
Yeah. So DeepNeuron was like the first one for me. So one of the papers that I did write actually did come from there. It was kind of like an extension out of the first project I mentioned, the Microscopium Deep project. Over a couple of years, it kind of got to a point where we ended up putting a section of it into like a review paper that one of the other groups that we had met along the way in one of the talks that we gave. They kind of approached us and asked us, "Are you interested in contributing to this review paper?" And we were like, "Yeah, sure." So that was part of it. Way that I got my research experience, which was like working, say, at Monash or something as like a research assistant, or through some like summer research project or whatever. So, for example, I worked in the robotics lab here at Monash over one of the summers, and then I continued on as a research assistant through the rest of the year, and I published my other paper out of there, which was one that I worked on primarily myself, which is a really big benefit when applying. If where you're applying to sees that you kind of published a paper, like you're kind of the primary author, you did most of the work. That's obviously a really big plus because it shows that you can do research basically. And a lot of postgrad programs kind of want to see before you apply that they can trust that you can do the work basically.
As someone that's deeply involved in AI research, what are your thoughts on the future direction of AI research? There's a lot of, like you said before, machine learning, deep learning, huge topics at the moment, along with ChatGPT. What are some of your thoughts in the, I guess, direction that AI will go?
Yeah. So I think right now what you see, and you'll still see this for a little bit because it just has a sort of, it's like still working basically, and it's very easy for companies to do, is basically you've got this process where scaling up large models with lots of data just works too well basically. So the idea being if you make a bigger transformer, you get more data, you chuck more compute at it. Right now, it's still just working, and it seems like these companies haven't hit the limit. Now, there's benefits for them to this. It's really easy to do. I guess for them, they just find more money and buy more stuff and scrape the web some more, and then they just get a better model. So it's not too risky, I guess, in that way. Yeah, like I said, the benefits are still there. You're still scaling, and the other thing is, it's too good to the point where trying an alternative approach currently it's just not. It doesn't seem to be feasible in industry or whatever. And so that's like industry, and I think we will probably still see that for a little while at least until it plateaus and we either run out of I don't know data to train on or something. I think you kind of see that there's this idea of the data's running out a little bit, which is why, for example, you kind of see this pivot from just the pure language models or whatever to more, I guess, multimodal models. So maybe we're aligning language and vision, or maybe we're working with the videos now. And so I think that will be seen for a little while in industry, at least. I think in academia, there's more, I guess, freedom to do different stuff. So for example, my lab seems to be my lab works more on multimodal stuff in a more general sense. So instead of just vision and audio and text, you might have different kind of vision primitives. So edges and depth and stuff like that, or different types of text, all that kind of stuff. And that it's you get more freedom. You see more freedom in academia, but you also see to make a difference, right, against these massive large models that are just scaling. And in academia, you can never compete with that, right? What you see is you're kind of forced to get more creative and see more innovation or whatever in academia. And so I think out of academia, you can expect to see more kind of interesting stuff that might get adapted into these large models. Now, this when it comes to the more longer term, I guess my question or concern is when we think of what might we really want artificial intelligence model or agent to really do. So do we want it to do some manual labor? Do we want it to do some creation or whatever?
Yeah,
My question is,
the process is sort of automated in that sense.
yeah. And so my question is the models that industry are developing right now, are they really aligned with those actual end goals, right? So for example, say that we want AI to be able to do really dangerous, challenging, physical tasks or something like that. Can generative models that can generate really fancy arbitrary scenes or even videos or whatever, is that really the way to get maybe really, really fancy advanced robotics models, whatever? And I think the answer is it might help a little bit, but when you look through robotics work right now, it's not necessarily entirely it's not really correlated with these massive generative models or whatever. So I think when it comes longer term, what I kind of expect is we're going to hit a point where maybe there's a refocusing on these are the real goals of what we want AI to achieve, and there might be a shift to kind of adapt to the work that's being done to fit those goals a little better. And you see this somewhat in robotics in academia, and they kind of work towards these goals a little bit more there. But
a little
yeah,
bit
I would
more
expect
than
maybe industry to pick it up. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I see, perfect. Well, we've talked about your journey all the way from high school to DeepNeuron to research. That is absolutely so inspiring. I think we might end it there. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights and experience with us. And everybody, look forward to another episode of Keeping Up with MDN. Thank you so much, Jason, for your time. It's been an
Thanks for
absolute
having
pleasure
me.
listening. Thank you so much.